Our guest is Ard Louis, professor of theoretical physics at the University of Oxford. Thank you for joining us. In partnership with filmmaker David Malone, you created the 4-episode Why Are We Here film series. Sponsored by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, would you begin by sharing with us why you found investing in that effort compelling?
Basically, they came to me, or the filming company came, Turn TV, and they said, hey, we would like to work on big questions, and you can help us decide who you would like to interview. So basically, I got, somebody to pay me to fly around the world and talk to interesting people. Who would say no to that, right? That was the first basic motivation for me doing it. I just thought it was interesting. I really like David Malone, the filmmaker. So there was that. David is an atheist, so very different from me. He's an atheist. He's an artist. I'm a Christian. I'm a scientist. So our stick was kind of to have two very different people, maybe subverting some stereotypes about the artist who kind of believes in impossible things and the scientist who's rational, therefore doesn't believe in God. It was also during the height of the new atheists, people who were basically taking science and claiming that this had all kinds of metaphysical implications for religion or for how we should live our lives. And David really disliked that. So he wanted to make a film that looked at big questions in a more thoughtful way. So that was basically it. But the real motivation, to be honest, was I get to talk to all these people that I've always wanted to talk to, ask them the biggest questions of life. I mean, how fun is that?
Yeah. You divided that series into 4 episodes. 1, meaning-seeking beings. 2, reality of ideas. 3, the animal within. And 4, the moral compass. Would you offer a few details concerning the arc of progression of those 4 episodes that you designed and followed?
The arc is really that you're starting by just asking, who are we as human beings? What does it mean to be human? Then you ask big questions about what is our universe like? What does that tell us about what it means to be human? In the end, we ask kind of big, more tricky questions like what might that mean for our actual daily lives? Like, are there moral truths in the universe, just like there are mathematical truths? So that's kind of the arc. I would say the arc is not a single arc in the sense of we're trying to tell one story. We're trying to tell a whole series of stories at the same time. And what we did, which is unusual, is that it was David and I who interviewed each person. So the 2 interviewers and 1 person being interviewed. And that often created a conversation, largely because David and I disagreed on a lot of issues. And as did often our person we interviewed with. So that created a 3-way conversation that I think the main thing that I was hoping to come out of that was that there are these really beautiful and deep questions that we should all be asking ourselves, that they're not simple, that they're complex, and that there is a really rich way of engaging with them. And that actually, for me, of course, coming from a Christian perspective, I wanted to give a Christian way of thinking about these, or a religious way of thinking about these, which I think is as intellectually strong. Like I think more, I think is more intellectually rigorous and more intellectually interesting than an atheist point of view. David obviously disagreed, which is part of the fun of making one of these movies.
In the end, as you were just echoing there, what sort of questions maybe do you hope to resolve for viewers? But then what questions, by the time they work through the end, do you hope that you also raise?
So the main one of our goals was actually that people would just have better questions at the end, rather than us giving them answers. So we didn't feel like it was our job to give people answers, but rather that we sharpen their questions and make them better. So I think that I hope we did. And one of the things we wanted to point out, for example, is that if you look at science, it points in many ways away from itself towards beauty, towards truth, towards something bigger than ourselves. That's one of the big questions. And what does that mean? That's really interesting. And we looked at questions like fine-tuning or evolutionary convergence or the evolution of cooperation, and asked, what does that mean? What does that tell us about our world? So part of it was taking kind of simplistic narratives about science simplistic narratives about physics or about evolution, and trying to point out that if you looked at the science in more detail, there's a much richer, more interesting, more fertile, more complex set of ideas that really point towards something bigger than ourselves. Actually point very often to religious questions or to philosophical questions. I mean, one of the points I wanted to make to people was that there are many things that we believe to be true that are non-empirical truths. There's truths that are not really decided by science or any kind of advance of science. And a simple example of that would be mathematical truths. So is it true that 1 + 1 is equal to 2, whether I know about it or not? We all think it is true. Then you get into really tricky questions on where does that truth then live? Well, it's not really a physical thing. It's true whether you believe it or not, whether the universe is made of material or not. And so once you realize that there are non-material realities that are mathematical realities or logical realities, the law of non-contradiction is true whether I believe it or not, whether it can be physically instantiated or not.
Yeah.
Then it quickly raises questions. Could there be other things that are true, like moral truths? Could these be true whether they're physically instantiated or not? And this raises really interesting and beautiful questions about are moral truths really out there, or are they merely something that we kind of negotiate as human beings among ourselves? And those are the kinds of questions that hopefully we sharpened a little bit, the kinds of questions that you would ask when you come out. We didn't have a set of answers to those questions, partially because David and I disagreed on many of the answers, as did our interviewers. But I think we did agree that these questions were rich and exciting, and that there are many ways of looking at them. And obviously, I had answers to some of the questions. David had answers to the questions, but we didn't want to foreground those. And we wanted actually our own answers to be challenged. And we probably rethought some of them. I definitely rethought a bunch of things that I believed by going around and thinking about these big questions.
Makes for a fascinating conversation then that you had in various locales and with a variety of people.
One of my favorite conversations was with a philosopher called Alex Rosenberg, who really believes in scientism. So he believes that science is the only really reliable way of getting truth. And that he also believes in basically physicalism. There's nothing except the natural worlds of atoms and molecules, and that's it. And David kind of believes this too, but David believes that there are moral truths. David believes that, there's meaning and purpose in the world. And so Alex and David have the same premises, but Alex basically believes that once you realize that there's nothing but atoms and molecules, then all these ideas we have of beauty and truth and morality kind of get eroded away. I disagree with Alex's premises, but I agree with his logic. Whereas David agrees with Alex's premises, but disagrees with his logic. And so we had a lot of fun discussing whether, if you believed in just atoms and molecules, whether you could ground all of these things that we hold as being beautiful and true and precious or not. And that was, I think, a very rich and interesting conversation that we both learned a lot from and enjoyed. Even though, Alex, if you look at the movie, really thinks I'm crazy because he thinks how could you possibly believe in God and be a scientist? I think he's nuts for not seeing how those two things connect together. But that's part of the fun of talking to each other. Yeah, so I mean, this kind of thing where if you actually look at the bits that made it to the film, at some point I think I forget exactly what he calls me, but something like you're schizophrenic if you believe those two to be true. But we had a great time afterwards. We had lunch, we talked, and we really enjoyed meeting. And so I think it's really fun when you can meet somebody with whom you fundamentally, profoundly disagree, and yet have a really deep and meaningful conversation about things that matter.
Yeah, thank you. So somewhere out there is fascinating footage that didn't make it into the film, then probably.
There's also that. I mean, so we have a website actually that has some of the longer outtakes, because we thought some of these conversations were so kind of interesting to look at. And I know people still use those. I've had people at various universities tell me they use them in philosophy classes to illustrate particular ideas for their students. We had a really incredibly interesting set of people that we interviewed. I mean, every single person was fascinating in one way or the other. Another example of was very touching to me was Jane Goodall, who recently passed away. And so I grew up with it in Gabon in Central Africa. I had a chimpanzee growing up as a pet. Basically, we lived in the jungle. The only meat people had was jungle meat that they hunted, and they without meaning to actually killed the mother. Didn't see the little baby that was holding to her chest. Normally, they wouldn't kill mothers with young, and so they brought it to us. We bought it for its weight in sardines and raised it. And then at some point, we brought it to a nature reserve in the hope that it would reintegrate, that Percha, our chimp, would reintegrate into the wild. And it's a tragic story because he actually got ill and died. And so Jane and I talked about that. It was very moving for me because she basically told me that, by having taken the chimpanzee so young and raised it, it would never have been able to reintegrate, even if we wanted to, because we were basically naive. And so I loved that conversation. And actually afterwards, we had a conversation about faith as well. Jane pulled me aside where David and the other film people couldn't hear us. And she said, you and I have lived in the African jungle. We know that there's something like God. You can't be there and not experience that. These people, she pointed to the people, said, they haven't seen that. They don't know, but we know. I had never thought about my own faith in that way until she articulated that. And I thought, yes, that's true. Part of the strength and the kind of conviction of my own faith has to do with growing up in the jungle and just seeing the power and the beauty of nature. It's hard to explain that if you haven't experienced it, but if you have, you know what you're talking about.
Thank you. I want to ask you a little bit more then about your upbringing and your education, which eventually led to your development as a theoretical physicist. As you just mentioned, you were born in the Netherlands and raised in Gabon. You returned then to the Netherlands, earning an undergraduate degree from Utrecht University, but then crossed the Atlantic to the United States, earning a PhD in theoretical physics from Cornell. At what point in time did the study of theoretical physics begin to prove compelling to you?
My parents are biologists. My father founded the herbarium of Gabon, which is where all the plants are stored.
Wow.
And so, I grew up with my parents always with their note. And my mother taught, she basically taught secondary school or high school, you call it in America. And then she also taught teachers how to teach biology and geology, actually. So I kind of grew up with my parents always stopping every tree and talking about it. And apparently, when I was about 15 or 16, I took them aside and said, Mom and Dad, I'm really sorry. I need to tell you something that's going to make you unhappy, that you're going to be displeased by, but, I feel like I need to tell you. Of course, when your teenager says that to you, I think children, you're nervous, right? And apparently, I don't know, I have a vague memory of this, but they have a very strong memory of this, which is that I then said, I'm going to be a physicist, not a biologist. And I thought they'd be very disappointed. They basically laughed and said, well, of course, that's totally fine. And it was basically, I was not interested. I thought biology was just, kind of stamp collecting. And, actually, I saw that they loved it. I saw that they had that kind of detailed interest in the natural world. But I just thought I wanted to look at patterns.
Yeah.
So at that age, I knew I wanted to do physics. I went to university. Utrecht was the best place to do theoretical physics. That's where I wanted to do. I didn't know whether I'd be able to do theoretical physics, whether I'd be good enough at physics, but I just loved it. And so I basically did it because I loved it. And it just one thing led to another. So that's, at the end of my undergraduate time, I had, Cornell was extremely strong in the kind of theoretical physics I wanted to do. There were a few people there that I really admired, whose books I'd read. I was absolutely thrilled to go there and work with them. And it was a great decision because Cornell is an extremely good place for the kind of theoretical physics that I do. And being in that very concentrated, very high performing environment helped me kind of raise my bar of what I thought was possible or what I thought was normal. And so I'm very grateful for my time at Cornell in teaching me that. I then moved after my PhD. So basically up to my PhD, I just did it, because I liked it. And every time I made the next step, I was just thrilled that I could make the next step. I didn't actually think that I would be able to do this the rest of my life. I just thought, let me do this while I can. I just love the subject. Obviously, when I finished my PhD, I was then offered a postdoc at Cambridge University. And then actually the person what really happened was I wanted to work with somebody who was working in France. I wrote to him and he said, well, I'm actually coming to Cambridge. Why don't you come with me? So that's the only reason I went to Cambridge. He moved from physics into chemistry in Cambridge. So I ended up being in the theoretical chemistry department. And that's where my kind of more interdisciplinary interest started to develop, because I started seeing all these really interesting questions that theoretical chemists were asking, and realizing that from using ideas and methods and techniques from physics, I could say something interesting about them. Mm-hmm. I did that for a number of years. I had like a junior faculty position there, and then a permanent position in Oxford came up. I was asked to apply. This is how it often works. And I applied and got the job and have been here ever since. But that interest in interdisciplinary work, or trying to use concepts from physics outside of the traditional domains of physics, mm-hmm. that really was built in my time in Cambridge. And that's something I've kept with me ever since.
Were there any mentors outside of the gift that your parents gave you of blessing your interest in physics and then theoretical physics? Any mentors who encouraged you along the way?
So when I was younger, maybe not so much. When I was an undergraduate, I just kind of ticked along for the first few years. There was one Christian professor at the University of Utrecht that I knew of, who was also an amazing lecturer. He was a quantum mechanics teacher, just unbelievably clear and lecturer. I think that helped me. It gave me, a plausibility structure that I could be a Christian and a scientist. Because I would say one of the big transitions for me moving from Gabon, where in an African context, religion is very much part of life. The question isn't, do you believe in God? The question is, which God do you believe in and how do you believe in God? But the idea that there is something outside us is just not really, just part of the culture is not really questioned. To a Dutch culture, which was deeply secular, where people basically said, you can't be smart and believe in God. It's a fairy tale. That was a big transition for me. So it helped to see him. So he was a mentor in that sense. In the Netherlands, the way it works is you do about a year of research at the end of your course, and that really that's a really important part of your time. Kind of gives people a sense about whether you're good at research or not, and gives you a sense about whether you can do a PhD or not. I worked with a very brilliant Dutch physicist called Dan Frenkel, and he ended up at Cambridge in theoretical chemistry as well, where he was the main chair there until recently. And I was very lucky that off the building that we were in had a shortage of space, so I had to sit in his office, and I overheard him talking on the phone. And every time somebody came in to discuss with him, I would overhear the conversation. And I really learned how to be a good scientist from him. I would still say that experience of my first steps into research were very much shaped by him. And he's a great thinker, a real truth seeker. And I just learned a lot about how to ask the right questions. Mm-hmm. He would always emphasize, the most important thing about research is being able to ask good questions rather than finding answers to boring questions. And so he'd always be asking, like, okay, so you're doing that, but why are you doing that? What's the big picture question? What's really interesting about that? That's never left me. So I still feel of myself as that's that first experience with research. And I also just loved research. When you're taking courses, you basically reproduce knowledge that's already known. Now, the exam is always, somebody knows the answer to the exam, but research is very different. Right? Nobody knows the answers to the questions, the interesting questions. There are lots of interesting questions that are unanswerable. There are lots of answerable questions that are uninteresting. And in between is that gray zone where they're the interesting questions that are both answerable. And that's much more creative, much more out of the boxy than the kind of coursework. And I just loved that experience. When I first really got into research, I thought, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I can't believe I'm being paid to think about all these interesting questions. They're so fascinating. And sitting in Dan's office and listening to all the people coming in and discussing their projects, I would listen in and hear about all these different projects. I would listen to him ask questions. And the funny thing was, I was a young undergraduate. Afterwards, he would turn to me sometimes and discuss his take on the conversation he just had, which I think was a very generous. I now look back and that's a very generous thing to do, that he treated me as a peer. I just thought it was normal that he would talk to me as a peer, and I would discuss what I thought about it, right? And it was an amazing experience for me. And I realized I was very, very blessed to be with, one of the world's greatest minds and just watch that mind work. And having reflected on it back afterwards, there's many, many things I still do that I realize I'm a Frankelian, which means down Franklin, and how I think, right? And how I think about the world, how I do my research. And I just learned a ton about it. And I still say that was my biggest scientific mentor, even though I left him. He wasn't very happy about this, that I left to go do a PhD elsewhere. I wanted to see something else. Also, I'd grown up in Africa. I'd gone back to the Netherlands. One of the things was that my parents are Dutch. They told me, you're Dutch. You're going to go out to Holland. And you're going to be Dutch. And I came back to the Netherlands and I realized I speak Dutch. I look Dutch, but this is not really my culture. I'm too different from these people. I like them, but I don't really feel that sense of belonging here. Why don't I go and, the world is big. Let's go look somewhere else. So I just thought, let me go somewhere else.
Yeah.
The classic kind of third culture kid experience, right? Your parents who were brought up in the culture think of themselves as being from that culture. Interestingly, my parents still live in Gabon. And now, they've lived there so long that they're basically Gabonese in their culture and their style of living. And I think if they were going back to the Netherlands and live, they'd be a huge and almost impossible cultural adjustment. But at the time, we all thought I would go back to the Netherlands, live a suburban life like any Dutch person. And I just realized that wasn't for me. This is why I wanted to go out. We went to the US and really loved that experience.
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. Are there any authors then also who have inspired you along the way, especially when it comes to sort of the interdisciplinary arrangement of ideas with which you work? You obviously spend your time, your days there in Oxford, which has been a center for thinking about the relationship shared by science and religion. But authors from the past or currently working that have helped you and nurtured your sense of vocation?
So that's a good question. So it depends a bit on which direction. I'll talk first about my science. Dan Frankel, who I mentioned, who's not well known outside of this very narrow field, he's a very interdisciplinary thinker. I learned a lot from him. I just got this prize from the Institute of Physics called the Sam Edwards Medal and Prize, which is the main prize in my subfield of subfield of subfield. So it's the big prize in my very tiny little area. And Sir Sam was a real huge inspiration for me, and his works were. So Sir Sam was one of the great geniuses of the last century. He took ideas from quantum mechanics and applied it to things that look very prosaic, like polymer molecules, and showed that you could understand a lot of things about these molecules, which look like maybe like a zoo of different complicated, messy things. And by using these mathematical techniques that came from quantum mechanics, you could suddenly bring order into this wide array of differentness and see really deep, profound patterns. And that really, I remember I read his book called The Theory of Polymer Dynamics. It just really amazed me. It had a big impact on the kind of work that I do. The kind of work I do is very much influenced by that type of an approach, taking ideas, so technical techniques, mathematical techniques that have worked in one area of physics, then applying it to an area that wouldn't traditionally have been called physics, and finding out that you can actually apply these ideas and turn it into a more physics kind of approach. So that's kind of the scientific. That book had a big impact on me. So that was one set of ideas that really impacted me. On my own, integrating faith and science. So there's another person that really impacted me, another mentor I now realize looking back. That was a professor at Cornell University called Dick Bear. He's a professor of environmental ethics. And he used to have us over for lunch at his house after church. And we would talk about some subject. And he was extremely widely read. And so we read this really wide range of things and talked about them. Because I came across Mark Noll's book, The Scandal of the Angelical Minds. And that had a big impact on me because I suddenly recognized that I myself had been also influenced by some of the these anti-intellectual sentiments that Noll points out. And then I read George Marsden's book, The Soul of the American University, which is a history of the kind of secularization of many of the major universities in the United States, like Harvard and Princeton and Yale, etc. And that really struck me because I suddenly understood a lot about my own university in Utrecht and the kind of what the culture was that they were living in and where that anti-religious sentiment came from. And also helped me realize why I thought that way of thinking was so thin. But the point was you can see it as being thin, but not know what the alternative might be, or not have a better story that you really want to tell. So you just think something's not right, but I'm not sure what the better story is. And they kind of pointed me towards a better story. And that was, mediated by Dick Bear, talking about these things in these concepts in very rich and interesting ways. So that was a really important mentor for me in my kind of thinking about faith and science. And then what also happened is a kind of classic thing for an academic is that I was invited to go. There's a big missions conference called Urbana, University every so often around New Year's time. And I had done a lot of work with international students, which is natural for me because having grown up in Gabon, I felt that worked really naturally for me. So they asked me to give a series of seminars on that, which I knew would be a niche topic. So I said, well, if you're going to fly me over it was in Illinois at the time, to Illinois, and I'm going to be there for a few days, why don't I give another seminar as well? So I'll do one on science and faith, which I'm interested in. I knew that would force me to read up on it. So I did. I read a bunch of books, gave a talk. And, my seminars on ministering to international students, were small and warm. But my seminar on science and faith packed out the room. People were in the corridors trying to squeeze in. After I finished, I was basically mobbed by students asking a million different questions. And I really touched on something that I touched on an itch there that wasn't being scratched by the Urbana conference. And that people just really, really had really existential questions about it. So that made me realize this is a really interesting thing to thinking about. So I started thinking about it more. I'm very lucky in the UK. You have people like John Polkinghorne, there's Alison McGrath, tons of people around that I could just talk to who are very deep thinkers on these topics. So I just devoured all of that stuff and learned a lot from them. And that's basically how I got interested in science and faith. Science and faith is a very interesting set of ideas. They're very different in certain ways. John Polkinghorne likes to talk about this, but they're cousinly different disciplines. They have overlap as well. And so I found that just absolutely fascinating, really interesting. And I just enjoyed thinking about it and reading about it and talking to people about it.
Yeah.
If I hadn't done that talk, I probably wouldn't have quite realized how interesting the topics are. I probably would have gotten into it, but not to the same extent. And one of the things that happens is once you give one talk, you get invited to give more talks. You have to, the best way to prepare to learn a new subject is to give a talk on it, right? Because it forces you to read stuff that you put on your bedside table for later. And so that's how I got into it. And I've been writing a lot about it and interested in it ever since.
Thank you. I want to ask you a little bit about sort of the day-to-day efforts of your work there at Oxford. You direct the Lewis Research Group, a group focused on exploring the dynamics of biological physics and the dynamics of soft matter. Efforts which, as you just mentioned a few minutes ago, led to the Institute of Physics to confer upon you the Sam Edwards Medal and Prize for distinguished contributions in soft matter physics. Would you provide an overview of the questions you and your colleagues pursue and perhaps give an example of one of your more recent projects or efforts?
Yeah, so soft matter is a big catch-all word for a lot of things that are basically soft. So you've got hard matter physics if you look at things like semiconductors, or metals or something of that nature, and then you've got soft matter physics if you look at polymers or colloids or anything that kind of wiggles and shakes. And so a lot of biological matter would fall under that category. And inspired by people like Sir Sam Edwards, physicists have been thinking about these kinds of problems for quite a while. Maybe I'll take a step back and say, physics kind of separates itself into people that look at fundamental particles, so very small things, or very big things like the astrophysics in the universe. And they're basically looking at you're trying to study something very large or something very small. There's also a very big, probably the biggest part of physics are people who look at the emergent phenomenon, which is where a set of many small things come together and something new emerges out of it. So a classic example would be wetness, right? So if I take one water molecule, it's not wet. 2 water molecules are not wet. 3 are not wet. But I put enough of them together, suddenly this property of wetness emerges that we're used to. The fascinating thing about wetness is it doesn't have to be water that's wet. Ammonia is wet, mercury is wet. So it turns out that wetness emergent property that's not a property of the individual molecule, but a property of a collective, can have many different instantiations on the bottom that give you the same collective behavior. So in self matter, I'm looking at that kind of physics. And I was very interested in self-assembly, so things that make themselves. So for example, your body is full of little machines that walk along tracks, little motors that spin. And these motors are made of many separate components. But these motors aren't made all in one go, and they're not made in a factory assembly line. Rather, your body makes proteins, which are little molecules that are the workhorse of the cell. Individually, they float around in the cell, jostled by thermal energy, and then they stick together in these very specific 3-dimensional shapes that have to be absolutely perfect. And there's little motors that will spin at 100,000 RPM, stop in a quarter of a turn. If I gave you one that you could see, with your eyes or hold in your hands, it would be made in a factory. But these things make themselves by just randomly wiggling around. It's like taking Lego blocks, putting glue on them, putting them in the box, shaking the box is how you simulate thermal motion. Then you open the box and out comes, say, a fully formed train. That would be absolutely amazing, but this happens all the time in life. So I was interested in how does that work? Well, so one of the ways that people have been studying these is by using DNA molecules. So DNA, we're used to using them or thinking about them as storage of information, but you can also use them to make really complicated structures. It turns out that DNA is the best self-assembly material we have for artificial self-assembly. You can make boxes that open and close. You can make walkers that walk on tracks. You can make little robots that do all kinds of amazing things that emulate what we can do in life. And for experimentalists, people do experiments, this is the best material that we understand the best. And so I've worked very long with my colleagues on a modeling method that allows you to predict what kind of shapes you're going to make, what's going to self-assemble out of the DNAs, and how those things will work. It's called OxDNA, so it's Oxford DNA. You can download it, you can use it. And so a lot of people, when they make experiments, they first test their ideas in OxDNA on the computer with our formulas to see whether that's going to do what they think is going to do. And then they'll try it. And then if they do something that doesn't quite work, they'll go back to this computer on which you can manipulate things, molecule by molecule by hand, and see where they can improve their designs. And so this has led to a lot of understanding of how these self-assembling things emerge from the individual units. And that's one of the things that I was given the prize for understanding and developing this with with a whole series of colleagues and very brilliant students and postdocs. This framework that's now used all around the world.
Yeah.
So I'm very proud of that. I think it's very exciting that it works. I mean, the really exciting stuff is that we are starting to understand how things self-assemble. We're starting to understand what the rules of self-assembly are. And if we can understand it, then we can emulate it and perhaps apply it in medicine or in nanotechnology. But just as an intellectual question, it's absolutely fascinating and beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you. Before we close our conversation today, I want to sort of step back and ask you about the academic vocation and how you understand it. Perhaps how do you define it? What's the good of it? What's its scope? And what practices sustain it?
Well, I think that's a very good question. So just as a little aside to introduce this, with my wife and some other friends here who are academics, we run a course called Developing a Christian Mind, which is basically helping Christian graduate students and above think about what it means to be a Christian in the academy. What does it mean that you are a Christian sociologist or a Christian physicist? How does your faith impinge on your work? And why are you doing that subject? One way of thinking about those things is that, is in theological terms. So if I take a doctrine like the theology of sin, this helps me understand what I'm doing if I'm a social scientist, right? Social sciences can be seen in one part as the study of sin and its impact on individuals and institutions and communities. I can also look at the doctrine of creation. Not was the world made by God at the beginning, but does God sustain the world right now? Does God care about stuff? That's often linked to a theory of the good.
Mm.
That also can be applied to the social sciences, because you're also studying the good in communities and institutions and individuals. And once you realize that, then it gives you a kind of a theological lens to what kind of work you're doing. And this helps us understand why we might be doing the kind of work that we do. And one of the motivations is just because this is the world that God has created, and it's a calling to discover that world, to understand that world. It's also true that as we understand that world better, we can do more good. Very obvious in fields like medicine or engineering, a little less obvious in theoretical physics, but that's also, it can be a very strong motivator for doing this work. So I think this kind of calling, I think we can have a real genuine calling to the academy that's really important. I mean, for me, this was not a theoretical question. When I had finished my graduate school, I was invited by a large Christian organization to help run it, basically. And I remember thinking that would be quite exciting. I could do Christian, real Christian work full time, all the time, have some influence. And I prayed about it and just really felt that wasn't the right calling for me. They then hired somebody else to be their CEO she was much better than I would have ever been. So that was definitely a confirmation. But that forced me to think about, why am I devoting my life to these physics questions?
Yeah.
And I think it's because that can be a real calling from God, to just understand something better about the world. And sometimes when I've discovered something new, which happens, occasionally, and I see something new, it's just amazing. And I want to praise the God who made that bit of the world that I've now understood. And I think that in and of itself can be a perfectly good motivator for the academic calling.
Thank you. What virtues, particularly moral and intellectual virtues, have you found are important for individuals to cultivate if they're seeking to flourish as physicists or theoretical physicists? And then what vices do we also need to be mindful of, which may threaten that ability to flourish?
Rather than answering that question in general, I'm going to answer it with one specific angle that I'm actually writing about with a friend of mine at Cambridge called Simeon Zoll. So the founding of the modern scientific methods, part of which happened here in Oxford with the founding of the Royal Society, was heavily influenced by a kind of re-understanding of the doctrine of sin that came with the Reformation. And the idea is basically, if sin affects us and affects our ability to understand truth about the world, so the noetic effects of sin, then we need to work in communities where others can check our work and make sure that we're not doing something wrong. And we need to go out and test our ideas in the natural world. We can't just sit on our armchairs and think about them and believe that they're true. The very famous theoretical physicist, Richard Feynman, once said, the first principle of science is that you must not fool yourself. Then you are the easiest person to fool. After that, you can just be conventionally honest. So I think that principle, he's basically re-articulating the kind of ideas that people like Robert Boyle and Bacon and others articulated much more clearly in theological terms at the founding of the modern scientific method, is that you always want to worry that you might fool yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why you need to do research in community. I tell my students, you can't think about this stuff on your own. You need to test your ideas with others constantly, because you can fool yourself. I mean, obviously, we want to be honest. It's kind of boring if you see scientific fraud or someone who's dishonest. I mean, it's bad, but we all know that's wrong, right? The much more tricky thing is, when do we fool ourselves, right? When do we get things wrong? That's why as imperfect as it is, and as irritating as it is, things like peer review are absolutely critical to the scientific method. And so I think that's probably the most important principle, is that we have that kind of humility, realizing that we can be wrong, that we need others to look at our work. And those can be others that are here in the here and now. Those can be others that come after us that re-examine our work. But that we are often wrong. And we see through a glass darkly. And that's actually a deeply Christian idea. Historically, had a huge impact on the founding of modern science. It's articulated in the kind of quotes I gave you by Richard Feynman. And I think that Christians really would do well to remember that that's also why we invest in institutions. Like, why do we have Christian institutions of higher learning? It's because we can't think about these things on our own without there being a community around us who spend a lot of time thinking about this and do check and correct and recorrect our ideas. You need that kind of sustained long-term investment in institutions. I think the scandal of the evangelical mind that's Mark Noll sort of articulated now, I think almost 40 years ago, is actually about, in his case, evangelicals losing sight of the very doctrine of sin that was so important in the founding of evangelical Christianity. And that's because they stopped understanding that they needed to build long-term institutions to be able to engage with the life of the mind, because they thought they could just do it on their own, right? In that kind of populist way. And that's fun. It's kind of interesting because it's actually so deep in the founding narrative, and they've somehow lost touch with their own roots. And that's a tragedy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Before we close our conversation then today, want to ask you to perhaps extend this thinking even a little bit more in relation to the church. And in what ways can the church be a partner that supports theoretical physicists? And in what ways can theoretical physicists also be supportive partners of the church?
Well, so I think those are excellent questions that are hard to give short answers to. But the first, I think, is that it's important for churches to support people who are theoretical physicists, for example, in their callings and help them discern their callings. So they need to, rather than them thinking that's a kind of strange thing that people do, why are you not doing real work? Why are you not doing the activist work that we care about? It's important for churches to support the life of the mind more generally and understand its importance. It's also important for churches to support people that are on the front lines of the academy spiritually and help them make them more rounded people. So, for example, for me, it's really important when I'm in church that I meet people who are not academics, who help me kind of, relativize some of the things that we sometimes get very incensed about as academics. We tend to think of ourselves as the center of the universe, and it's helpful to have people sometimes around you for whom that's not the case. Yeah. So those are all helpful ways that they can keep us grounded. That's something churches often do well. What they have more difficulty with is understanding this as a calling. Mm-hmm. But I think for those of us who are, Christians in the academy, it's important that we try to explain to our fellow Christians who are not academics what the big ideas are, where they're going, how this interacts with the life of the church. And, the academy doesn't reward that kind of work. And so we have to do that, I think, anyway, even though it's not necessarily rewarded. I mean, in an ideal world, we would change the incentive structures to make that more important. I also think that in some cases, it's precisely by the guilds that we're in our academic worlds are often also very determining about what's important, what's not important. And we can get stuck in certain ruts. And sometimes talking to the church can help us break out of those ruts. It can help us as Christian scholars maybe have a richer set of questions that we might be interested in, a rich set of ideas that would be intellectually very fruitful. So I think that can go both ways, back and forth. I mean, right now, I'd say, in the evangelical church or in the kind of more Orthodox Protestant church, these connections have become very weak. There's a lot of suspicion of the academy. Academics, if I speak to academics and ask them about their church, they often moan. That's a dangerous, both for the academics and for the church. And that situation, that's, it's a scandal, as Mark Noll points out, and it's something that is incredibly important that we try to work on and mitigate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our guest has been Ard Louis, professor of theoretical physics at the University of Oxford. Thank you for taking the time to share your insights and wisdom with us.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.